The call came in just after midnight on an October night in 1918, when the county station was supposed to be silent. The old switchboard hadn't lit up for hours, and the town itself was already asleep under a blanket of cold autumn rain. When the phone suddenly rang, the sharp sound sliced through the quiet like a knife. The desk sergeant hesitated before answering, because everyone in the station knew one thing: the northern logging road lines had been dead for years, torn down after a fire destroyed the relay tower. No voice should have been able to come through from that direction. Yet the signal was clear, steady, and persistent, as if something on the other end was determined to be heard. When the receiver was lifted, a weak, broken voice spilled through the line, trembling and uneven, buried under static and distant echoes. The caller didn't give a name. He didn't even sound fully human. All he said was, "They're screaming in the fog, please. They're screaming in the fog." Over and over again, like a recording stuck on a loop. Between each sentence, there were long pauses where only breathing could be heard. Slow, heavy breathing, not from one person, but from several layered together. The line crackled violently, as if the wires themselves were struggling to carry the sound. The desk sergeant tried to ask for a location, but the voice interrupted him, suddenly sharper, more urgent. "White Silence Valley," it whispered. That name froze the entire room. Every officer knew the legend. The valley had been abandoned years earlier, after miners claimed the fog moved on its own and voices followed travelers through the trees. No official reports existed, but rumors lived longer than records. The sergeant's hand tightened around the receiver as the voice repeated the name again, slower this time, like a warning instead of a request. Across the room, 4 officers were preparing to end their shift. They heard the name and stopped moving. No one ordered them to go, not officially. But silence filled the station, heavy and thick, until one of them slowly reached for his coat. Another picked up his rifle. A third grabbed a lantern. The fourth tightened his belt and said nothing at all. There was an unspoken understanding that whatever had just come through that phone wasn't something that could be ignored, and whatever was happening in that fogged valley was already waiting for them. As they stepped outside, the air felt wrong, colder than it should have been for October, sharper, heavier, like winter breathing down their necks. Fog was already creeping along the street, sliding low across the ground, wrapping around fence posts and wagon wheels. In the distance, toward the northern road, a thick white wall was forming where no fog should have been able to gather. The horses in the stable were restless, stamping and snorting, refusing to calm down. And somewhere far beyond the trees, a faint sound drifted through the night, something that almost sounded like crying carried on the wind. The moment the officers crossed into the valley, the fog closed around them like a living thing. It wasn't drifting or rolling the way fog normally did. It stood still, thick and dense, pressing against their faces and uniforms. Lantern light barely pushed a few feet ahead before dissolving into white nothingness. The trees on either side of the logging road faded into pale shadows, their outlines warped and twisted as if seen through water. Every breath tasted damp and metallic, and the deeper they rode, the more it felt like the fog was sealing itself behind them, cutting off the world they had just left. Sound vanished almost immediately. Hoofbeats that should have echoed off the trees were swallowed whole. The creak of leather saddles, the clink of metal gear. Even the officers' own voices seemed to die the moment they left their mouths. One officer turned to speak to the man behind him, only to see lips moving without hearing a single word. Panic flickered across his face as he tried again, louder this time, shouting into the fog. But the shout fell flat, as if the air itself refused to carry it. The horses sensed it before the men fully understood. They slowed, heads low, ears twitching wildly, muscles tight beneath their coats. One horse suddenly stopped, refusing to move no matter how hard its rider kicked. Its eyes were wide and rolling, fixed on something hidden in the fog just off the road. The officer followed its stare, raising his lantern, but the light revealed nothing, only swirling white and the uneasy feeling that something had just moved out of sight. As they pushed forward, the temperature dropped sharply, cold biting through wool coats and gloves. Frost began to form on mustaches, on reins, on the metal of their rifles. Their breath came out in heavy white clouds that vanished too quickly, absorbed by the fog. One officer reached out and brushed his hand against what he thought was a tree trunk. But the surface felt wrong, smoother than bark, and warmer than it should have been in the freezing air. He pulled his hand back quickly, saying something the others never heard. Then came the first sound, not loud, not clear, but unmistakable. A distant whisper slid through the fog, circling them, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't words, not exactly, but it carried the rhythm of speech, rising and falling, as if something was trying to remember how human voices worked. The officers tightened their grips on their reins, lanterns shaking slightly. As the whisper grew closer, threading itself through the silence the fog had stolen. Morning came slowly, like it didn't want to touch the valley. The fog thinned just enough for pale sunlight to leak through, revealing the empty logging road where the officers had disappeared. Hours passed with no sign of them, no hoofbeats, no voices, just silence stretching longer than it should. When the first horse emerged from the fog near the edge of town, heads turned instantly. It walked stiffly, sides heaving, eyes glassy and unfocused, as if it had run for miles without rest. Soon the others followed one by one, drifting out of the white like ghosts. All 4 horses returned alone. Their saddles were still fastened, stirrups swinging gently with each step. Leather straps were soaked through, darker than rainwater should have made them. The smell that clung to the animals wasn't mud or sweat. It was sharp and cold, like damp stone and old air pulled from underground. Townsfolk reached out to steady them, then recoiled when they noticed how violently the horses were trembling. The officers' gear told a story no one wanted to understand. Rifles were still secured in their scabbards. Lanterns hung empty, wicks burned down to nothing. One saddle had deep scratches along the side, long and uneven, as if something had clawed at it while the horse was still moving. Another had a badge twisted backward, the metal bent in a way that suggested force applied slowly, deliberately. There was no blood, no torn clothing, just signs of struggle without a struggle ever being seen. Search parties followed the horses' muddy tracks back toward the valley, but the trail ended abruptly at the fog line. Hoofprints, boot marks, all of it simply stopped, as if the ground beyond that point had never been touched. Men walked in circles, shouting names, firing signal shots into the air, listening for any reply. The fog gave nothing back. Even sound seemed to hesitate at its edge, muffled and weak, like it was being swallowed whole. By noon, unease had settled over the town like a second fog. Mothers pulled children indoors. Doors stayed locked. The horses refused to enter their stalls, rearing and whining whenever the valley came into view. One animal collapsed without warning, legs folding beneath it, eyes fixed on the horizon. As men gathered around, they noticed something etched into the dust on its flank. Faint lines, almost like writing, already fading, as if whatever had marked it didn't want to be remembered. The official search lasted 3 weeks, though most people swore it should have ended sooner. Dozens of men combed the valley's edge every morning, stepping just far enough into the fog to mark their courage without tempting fate. They carried ropes, rifles, dogs trained to track human scent, dogs that refused to move once the fog brushed their noses. Handlers dragged them forward until the animals whimpered, tails tucked, bodies shaking, before finally giving up. Whatever had taken the officers left no trail the living could follow. Reports began to pile up on the sheriff's desk, each one thinner than the last. No evidence of violence, no sign of bodies, no explanation for how 4 trained officers vanished without leaving footprints. Maps of the valley were redrawn again and again, measurements adjusted, boundaries debated. Each version looked slightly different, as if the land itself refused to stay consistent on paper. One surveyor quietly resigned after claiming the compass needle spun wildly whenever he tried to chart the fog line. As days turned into weeks, the tone of the investigation shifted. What began as urgency hardened into frustration, then slowly into denial. State officials arrived, asked their questions, and left with tight jaws and empty notebooks. Theories were whispered but never written down. Bandits, deserters, sinkholes, mass hysteria. None of them explained why clocks stopped working near the valley, or why men reported hearing their own names called from inside the fog when no one else was around. Eventually, orders came down from higher up. The search was to be suspended. The valley was declared unsafe, access restricted, and the disappearance officially labeled unresolvable due to environmental factors. Wooden warning signs were hammered into the ground along the northern road, their letters painted in bold black strokes. Within months, moss crept over the words, softening the warning until it blended back into the forest like it had never been there. The case files were boxed, tied with twine, and pushed into the back of a records room that already smelled of dust and forgotten ink. Each folder was stamped UNCLVD, the ink pressed so hard it bled through the paper. Over the years, the building changed hands, shelves were moved, and entire cabinets vanished during renovations. Yet the box containing the 4 officers' names never seemed to leave the room. No matter how many times the records were reorganized, it always reappeared in the same dark corner, waiting where no one ever looked. In the summer of 2018, the valley was no longer a place people talked about. It was a line item in a government budget. Plans to cut a new access road through the northern hills were approved without ceremony, signed by officials who had never heard the old stories. Heavy machinery rolled in at dawn, engines growling as they chewed into soil that hadn't been disturbed in 100 years. At first, everything seemed normal, until the fog began to gather slow and quiet, long before weather reports said it should. The crew noticed the cold next. Even under a clear sky, their breath showed in thick white clouds. Instruments malfunctioned without explanation. GPS units flickered, radios hissed with static, and one excavator stalled repeatedly when its arms swung too close to the tree line. Workers joked nervously about bad ground and old legends, but no one laughed when a foreman pointed out that the fog was circling the site instead of drifting with the wind. The bucket of an excavator struck something solid just before noon. The sound was wrong, a hollow metallic clang that echoed deeper than stone. Work stopped immediately. Men climbed down, shovels replaced machines, and dirt was cleared by hand. 6 feet below the surface, they uncovered a rusted metal strongbox, edges eaten away by time, its lid sealed tight as if it had been buried on purpose rather than lost. When the box was finally pried open, the air around it seemed to shift. Inside lay 4 tarnished badges, their numbers still visible beneath layers of corrosion. Nestled beside them was an old camera, leather cracked, lens fogged from the inside. No one spoke. A century underground should have destroyed everything inside. Yet the camera felt strangely warm, as though it hadn't been buried at all. As the items were cataloged and wrapped, one worker swore he heard footsteps moving just beyond the fog line, slow and deliberate, pacing them. Another claimed the fog thickened whenever someone said the year 1918 out loud. By the time authorities arrived, the valley was quiet again. The strongbox loaded into a truck, and the fog retreating back into the trees, lingering just long enough to watch them leave. The camera was sent to a preservation lab that specialized in recovering images from damaged film, the kind of place that handled artifacts pulled from shipwrecks and collapsed buildings. Technicians worked slowly, wearing gloves, speaking in hushed tones as if the device might hear them. The film inside shouldn't have existed anymore. Moisture, pressure, and time should have reduced it to dust. Yet when the casing was opened, the reel was intact, tightly wound, untouched by rot. One technician noted that the inside of the camera was completely dry, as though it had never been buried at all. When the first image began to form in the chemical bath, the room went silent. Shapes emerged through the haze. 4 figures standing close together, coats heavy, hats pulled low. The fog around them was thick, swallowing the edges of the frame, making it impossible to tell where the ground ended and the air began. Their faces were visible, frozen in sharp detail, eyes wide, jaws tight, expressions caught somewhere between disbelief and terror. This wasn't a posed photograph. It was taken in a moment when none of them were ready. As the image cleared further, details surfaced that made no sense. The timestamp etched along the film's edge read, October 17, 1918. 3 days after the officers had officially vanished. According to records, the camera should have been lost with them, never recovered, never used again. Yet the photograph existed, undeniable proof that someone or something had pressed the shutter long after the riders were supposed to be gone. Then technicians noticed the background. Behind the officers, partially hidden by the fog, stood a shape that didn't belong to the landscape. It was tall, towering above them, its outline warped and uneven, like it couldn't decide what form to take. There were no clear limbs, no recognizable features, except for 2 pale points of light hovering where a face should have been. The fog around the shape seemed thinner, pushed away, as if it'd been around whatever was standing there. The final detail was almost missed. Along the lower edge of the photograph, barely visible beneath a smear of chemical residue, were faint impressions, marks pressed into the film itself, not written in ink. When magnified, they resembled fingerprints, too long and narrow to be human, overlapping each other as if multiple hands had been holding the photograph from the inside while the image was being captured. The handwritten note was discovered at the bottom of the strongbox, folded so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. The ink was faded but unmistakable, the handwriting confirmed by archivists to belong to one of the missing officers. What unsettled them wasn't just that the writing matched, it was the condition of the paper. Unlike the badges and the box, the note showed no signs of decay, no water damage, no mold. It looked as if it had been written recently, despite being buried for a century. The message itself was brief, uneven, and desperate, as though the writer's hand had been shaking. The fog isn't weather, it's a doorway, and it knows our names. There were no dates, no explanations. Only those two sentences repeated again beneath the first, each time growing sloppier, darker, the pressure of the pen tearing slightly through the paper. Analysts noted that the phrasing didn't match language common to the time period, as if the officer had been struggling to describe something no existing words could fully explain. As the evidence was logged into the county archive, small irregularities began to surface. Digital records glitched when the case number was entered. Surveillance cameras inside the evidence room briefly lost signal whenever the strongbox was moved. One clerk reported hearing footsteps behind him while cataloging the note, slow and measured, stopping whenever he turned around. The temperature in the room dropped without explanation, cold enough to fog the glass on the display case. That same night, a security guard working the late shift noticed something strange on the monitors. A thin white haze was creeping along the floor of the hallway outside the evidence room, rolling low and deliberate, despite the building's sealed ventilation system. As it moved, motion sensors triggered one by one, lights flickering overhead. The guard radioed for confirmation, his voice tightening as the fog reached the evidence door and began to seep through the frame. When staff returned the next morning, the evidence room was empty. The strongbox was gone. The display case stood open, untouched, no sign of forced entry. On the desk where the note had been examined, a faint layer of moisture clung to the surface, cold to the touch, and written into that dampness, barely visible as it slowly evaporated, were 4 names, each spelled exactly as they appeared in the 1918 case file. The valley remains closed to this day. Officially, it's marked as unstable terrain, too dangerous for construction or travel. Unofficially, locals say the fog still appears on nights when the air is clear and the wind is still. It rolls in slowly, hugging the ground, stopping right where the warning signs begin, like it's respecting a boundary it once ignored. No trace of the strongbox was ever recovered. The photograph was never officially released, and the case files, once again, were sealed and quietly moved to a restricted archive. Some say the decision was made to protect the public. Others believe it was made to protect whatever still lives beyond the fog, because one detail was never added to the report. In the weeks that followed, dispatch logs recorded unexplained calls after midnight. Each time, the line came from a dead zone with no active service. And every caller said the same thing in a voice barely above a whisper: "We're still riding."
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.